The next type of malware we're going to discuss is the worm. Now, come on, you didn't really think you were going to get out of a discussion on worms without seeing a cheesy picture of a worm on a keyboard. Worms are the third type of malware that we'll discuss, and they can be very similar to Trojans and viruses, but they have some unique characteristics. Worms typically carry malicious payloads that can infect hosts and turn them into zombies. By zombie machines, we're talking about machines that have the capability to attack other machines. And normally this might be from machine to machine, but they can also become members of botnets. And these botnets, when combined and grouped together and controlled centrally, can attack large numbers of computers, entire networks, and can bring enterprise-level networks down. So worms can carry the payloads that infect hosts to do that. One popular modern example of a worm that we've probably all heard about was the infamous Stuxnet. And Stuxnet was a worm that attacked industrial control systems. Now, there was some speculation as to who invented Stuxnet, and it's never actually been officially proven who did, but most people suspect it was a nation-state, a government of some kind. Now, Stuxnet has been out for a while, and it's been analyzed, and it's a classic example of a worm that was used to take advantage of some sincere weaknesses in the target system. Worms aren't like viruses and Trojans in many different ways. First of all, worms self-replicate through the network. They don't need a file as a carrier like a virus does. A virus has to be stuck in a file and sent via email or through a USB stick or network share or something like that. A user actually has to execute that file and get it manually from host to host. Worms don't need that. Worms self-replicate through the network. They can use chat, they can use IRC, they can use several different network programs and services to spread. The other thing about worms is they generally don't alter programs. Viruses do. Viruses can change program characteristics like file size and so forth, but worms generally don't do that. Worms are concerned with spreading and releasing their payload. Now, worms can actually be very easy to remove from a single host, but not from a large network. Once you get it removed from a host, it typically will spread back to that host unless you pull the plug on it and take it off the network. To clean a worm off of a network is a very large endeavor. That's why in some ways, from a network perspective, worms are typically more destructive than viruses. A virus may destroy data on an entire host, and that's very destructive. Or it may spread to other hosts through manual means and get a lot of hosts. But worms spread by themselves, and that's the problem. They can infect a large number of hosts over a large network, and it's very hard to kill. As soon as you clean off one host, it affects another one, and eventually may come back to the original host you cleaned. Worms are used to create botnets, and those are used to conduct distributed denial of service attacks on networks and other hosts. They require much more effort to remove from the network, and in fact, in some cases may require wiping the entire network to do so. In other words, you may have to wipe and rebuild your Exchange server, your domain controllers, your file servers, because it may be hard to get rid of because it keeps coming back. As soon as you think you've gotten rid of it, you plug it up in the network and it comes back. So it may require a rebuild of the entire network infrastructure. Now, some examples of worms that are out there include some that are a little bit older. In fact, the first worm was the Morris worm. Robert Morris invented the first worm back in 1988, and coincidentally for his actions, he was also the first person convicted under the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So he got some community service out of that deal, and now he's a tenured professor and an entrepreneur. However, he created the first worm called the Morris worm to demonstrate security vulnerabilities on the internet, which wasn't very big at the time, but it cost him some jail time. Now, some other popular worms include the I Love You worm, which is really called a virus, but it was a worm, the MyDoom worm, Win32 Conficker, and there are other examples out there. SQL Slammer was a big one that attacked Microsoft SQL servers. Stuxnet, obviously, we mentioned. Now, since we've been talking about malware, and worms in particular, what are some things we can do to prevent worms? Well, we can definitely install antivirus and anti-malware, and they will pretty much pick up most worms and viruses, not always. And we've talked about ways that you can prevent a piece of malware from being detected by bit flipping or encryption. But as a user or as a network administrator, you can make sure all media gets scanned, because the infection starts somewhere. It can start with media or start with an email attachment, so you should scan email attachments as well. Use intrusion detection systems and other security devices. One thing about worms is when they start to propagate, they can be noisy. So when you start seeing a lot of traffic, weird traffic, moving from system to system across the network, that might be an indication that you're under attack from a worm. So an IDS or even a sniffer might tell you that. So sniff through your network traffic and look for unusual signs that may indicate an infection. If you have an infection or think you do, unplug the infected host from the network, especially before it gets time to spread. So if you unplug that host, you can clean that host hopefully and contain it. Or if you wind up cleaning other hosts on the network, at least that one's not plugged in to get reinfected. You want to make sure you clean every single one of them and it's all gone before you plug anything back in. And the final thing you should do, obviously, the most important thing you should do is educate users. And this is because most users are, unfortunately, the reasons that a lot of malware gets on systems, and hackers rely on that. They rely on users not following procedures, not thinking about things before they click on them, and so forth. So from a security perspective, those are some countermeasures. From a hacker perspective, though, we'll take a look in the next session at some popular worm programs.